for me? Can you all hear me? Yes, great. Okay. And thanks to Lynn for being here. So moderator's privilege. I'm going to set the table here a little bit. So as you just heard, my fabulous laurels. I have been covering higher education for a long time. Prior to the recession, I have to tell you, it could be a little slower. And it's picked up since then, and it feels like it's a fever pitch right now. You know, that saying, may you live in interesting times, which I believe is a curse. Mistrust of higher education and frankly all institutions, including journalistic publications. What's driving that? Quite a few things. In higher education's case, obviously concern about student debt levels, return on investment for your degree programs, relevance to jobs, politics, views that liberal education is indoctrinating students. And you know, we've seen some amazingly alarming, depending on your perspective, polling to that effect. A couple of years ago, we almost broke the internet with our coverage of the Pew poll that showed that Republican voters and folks who lean Republican over 2 years, their perception of higher education as being a net positive for the country declined 22 percentage points in 2 years, which is quite a bit. And it's not just folks on the right. I'll get to the left in a second. But in other problems, we've got a demographic cliff looming. And it's not, I mean, in a couple of years, the projections of declining traditional college student populations, 15% in some places, really alarming. And it's not like it's been easy lately, as you may have heard, particularly for state institutions, but small privates as well. The most extreme example of late would be Alaska's governor, through veto of his veto power, stripping 41% of the public university system's state contribution out with a stroke of a pen. Just really unprecedented level cuts. We've seen a couple that get close to there, but not much. And then, as you all have heard of the Chetty social mobility data, show of hands, who's heard of that? Raj Chetty you have to look up the social mobility index for some light reading. It probably came out a couple years ago, really fascinating data set that shows, unfortunately, quite a bit of higher education is not advancing student social mobility at all. And in fact, gives a lot of evidence to higher ed as an engine of inequality. One of the most alarming findings was that the 28 most selective colleges enroll more students from the top 1% of income earners than the bottom 60%, I believe. So, you know, these pressures are pretty intense. And then you throw varsity blues on top of it. The varsity blues admission scandal, which continues to roll. We've never seen this level of interest in my career in higher education and admissions. And, you know, talking to pollsters on the left, Democratic pollsters, just seeing phenomenal shift in people saying, you know what, higher education's not for me. The deck is rigged. It's structured for wealthy people and not for me. And that obviously poses quite a challenge to higher education. And also, not just public perception, but we're seeing in Congress, folks who traditionally are higher education's allies, congressional Democrats, maybe not so much anymore. You know, we've seen serious bills that look to take federal aid eligibility from colleges that do legacy admissions. And I think for people who feel like this is gonna blow over, you might not take that position right now. So Lynn, with that easy kind of relaxing start to the day, can you talk about some of the kind of primary concerns you have in your organization to kind of cope with these challenges?
Yes, all of those concerns. At AAC&U, our mission is to advance the vitality and public standing of liberal education and equity as the foundations for excellence in undergraduate education in service to democracy. So we believe that there's an inextricable link between our nation's historic mission of educating for democracy and a liberal education. Excuse me. So for the past year and a half, AAC&U has been engaged in the implementation of a comprehensive integrative strategic plan that is endeavoring to contest accusations of irrelevancy and illegitimacy that have been leveled against higher education in general and liberal education in particular. And so we've issued this urgent call to action, and the urgency is enhanced by the fact that we are living in an ostensibly post-truth era, where there is a disdain for expertise. There has been criticism of higher education because of for all the reasons you mentioned, that there are those who believe that higher education is too expensive, it's too difficult to access, it doesn't teach people 21st century skills, and those who believe that there is they conflate liberal education and liberalism, the notion that we are brainwashing students to become the next generation of snowflakes who will melt at the slightest abrasion of their sensibilities. They believe that we are tearing apart the fabric of American society. And so the latest poll that you mentioned, where now this partisan divide has closed, with people unified in believing that higher education no longer has a positive impact on our society, but actually has a negative impact, needs to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed immediately, because the most critical challenge facing higher education today is the growing economic and racial segregation. Democracy cannot flourish in a nation divided into haves and have-nots. And so if we are to fulfill higher education's promise in America of educating for democracy, we need to ensure that all students have access to excellence in higher education. And so this is our primary concern right now.
So how do you make the case? And I know we don't have, you could do that for longer than the hour we have here, but in terms of the relevance of a liberal education to someone who's considering, putting their time, money, and energy into earning a degree for the workforce. Can you kind of summarize how you would talk to a skeptic about the relevance of the current system?
Well, we know the data from reports in Inside Higher Ed about how many jobs this generation, future generations will have. If you are going to have 17 jobs over a lifetime, 11 jobs within the first 10 years, when you embark on a career, the narrow technical training that's often delivered in institutions today isn't going to do you any good. You need adaptability, flexibility, in the face of rapid change, where rapid change means rapid obsolescence. You need to be able to write, speak, and think with precision, coherence, and clarity, anticipate and respond to objections. Most importantly, you need to work in diverse teams and engage in what Martha Nussbaum refers to as moral imagination, or what Anna Devere Smith talks about in terms of the capacity to put oneself in the words of another different from oneself, to listen critically and to imagine what it's like to be them. So the vocationalism, the pre-professionalism that's being pushed is not enough. And we believe that there's a false dichotomy between that type of education and a liberal education. We can do both, but we have to promote integrative learning in a way that will help students prepare for a future that none of us can fully comprehend at this moment.
Yeah, I do feel like as a critique of society writ large, everything is either all or nothing. And obviously, higher education does do quite a bit of preparation for the workforce while also ascribing to the higher ideals you describe. Can you do both in a resource-strapped environment for more open access institutions? Can you teach job-relevant skills while also preparing people as citizens in the current structure, whether that, and I'm talking about federal subsidies, state support, et cetera?
Absolutely. I started my career in education in a community college. I was at 17 years old, attended a rural community college in northeastern Connecticut. I had a full scholarship to attend my state's flagship institution, and decided to forego that to serve as a caregiver for my mother, who was chronically ill. And the education that I received in this college that had just opened up a few years earlier, that was taught in the basement of the local churches. It was taught at the, we used the high school laboratories or the local technical college classrooms. The faculty offices were in trailers. The president's office was up a dirt road at a small airport, one runway. There was a true sense of community, though. We were embarking on a shared endeavor. And community colleges, remember, opened up after World War II as a means of providing broad access to education. And the fact that we are stigmatizing community colleges as we open the gates to first-generation students, to students of color, to women, is no accident. So I went to school under CETA funds, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. And those funds were reserved for students who were thought of never being capable of having permanent employment due to extreme social and economic disadvantages. So I worked 35 hours a week being trained in a technical profession, but I wanted to be a philosopher. And the liberal education I received at that community college provided me a foundation for life. It allowed me to live my best and most authentic self by providing a framework for becoming an innovator in my own life. So any institution can do that. What we need to do is destabilize the structures that mitigate against the kind of mentoring and high-impact practices that are necessary for all students to have access to excellence in higher education. So start giving tenure and promotion for faculty who are grounded in their communities, who are serving as public intellectuals, who are excellent mentors, who are excellent humanities practitioners in the classroom.
I want to follow up on that, but first a question, because it's top of mind for me. Last week, Amazon announced that they're going to spend $700 million retraining a third of their US workforce, so 100,000 workers, many of whom are likely to be replaced by automation, to give them credentials to bring them into IT, machine learning tools, next level skills to try to retain their workforce. And as I read the release at 10 p.m. at night, I saw that higher ed wasn't really part of it at all. Some of their tools they do offer through community college partnerships, but they've created their own. Providers are building 60 campuses at their distribution centers. They have a machine learning university. They've hired some of the world's experts on online learning, like Candace Till. And to us and to some of our experts that we talked to, it seemed like a bit of a shot across the bow of higher education in terms of at least a couple large. Google's doing a similar thing too. They have their own IT certificate where they control the curriculum. They are the instructors. These are obviously two unusual companies that are kind of nation states that can do whatever they want. In IT, where there's incredible hiring pressures, but I'm definitely getting the sense from some of these companies that they feel that higher education doesn't move fast enough for them, isn't able to do what they need at scale. What do you say to that? What do open access colleges need to do better to meet that need? Or is this a misperception from the employers?
Oh, I think we do need to partner in a more intentional way with not only business and industry, but K through 12, and making sure that all students have the skills necessary for their first job, but also for advancement. So we did a survey of 501 CEOs and 500 hiring managers of companies last year. And the results showed that while the employers believed that students were very well prepared for entry in the workforce, that they weren't prepared for advancement. They thought that the students fell shortest in terms of their oral communication capacity, their ability to work in teams, and their tolerance for boredom.
What could be driving that?
I don't know. So they reported that people came in and they wanted a raise after 6 months, and they wanted to do something interesting. So they weren't given those problem sets that were fascinating, that were constructed by their professors. So we have been talking to business and industry about how we can partner, and Candace was on our board for a number of years. And so I'm thrilled that she's leading that work, because I know that she's committed to liberal education and to assessing students in ways that will not ask them to answer questions for which we already know the answers, but will engage students in real-world problem solving in the context of the workforce, not apart from it, and that those problems are driven by student interest and student agency.
Sure. And it's not all negative. I feel like there's been a shift in tone in the U.S. chamber set of late, or even big tech companies. I was at the ASU GSV the last few years, which is a big venture capital and ed tech Lollapalooza in San Diego. And the first few years, it felt like higher ed's broken, and we're going to fix it, and we're going to do our own thing, and we're going to replace all the universities. And now there's much more of, actually, as employers, I'm wondering if you saw any of this, we don't send the right signals in hiring. We haven't worked as closely with colleges as we should. A little bit more. I don't want to be kumbaya here, but I do think I'm seeing a little more responsibility taken by employers for their role and the mismatch. But as a side point, I've been talking to Google about their IT certificate program, which, by the way, enrolled 75,000 students last time we asked. And they don't have to tell us that. They'll remind you that. Google isn't impressed by Paul Fain at Inside Higher Ed. But when they told me that their curriculum is designed to be 8 months for entry-level students, I asked, really entry level? Yes, really entry level. I went to a couple community colleges that were offering it for credit, and they said, oh, no. We have to remediate for several weeks to prepare students for this. Mm-hmm. And then I went back to Google and told them that, and they said, nope, it's entry level. And I wonder, when you think about employers, like what on their side of things, what do you see as some of the key impediments for working better with this student population and with colleges?
Well, the impediments are that we're working on different schedules. Faculty control the curriculum in colleges and universities, and that's part of faculty autonomy and one of the foundations of shared governance. Presidents, vice provosts cannot go in and say, okay, we're going to do this now because we've got this money from Amazon,
Sure.
and so just get with the program. That would be a disaster, and it would disrupt the very core of higher education. So we need to find some way to allow for innovative approaches to responding to workforce needs and to serve the needs of our students. At Mount Holyoke, we had a program of embedded practitioners, people outside of the faculty coming in to team teach courses focused on workforce training. But we also provided incentives for connecting curriculum to career. We allowed departments to develop new websites, to have internships. I provided paid internships for each of the students during her time at Mount Holyoke as a way of addressing the hidden inequities that can take place in college and university campuses where not all students can afford to take an unpaid internship. Right. So by paying those and by working with our alumni network, we were able to address some of those issues. But as I said earlier, colleges and universities need to be intentional about providing access to these opportunities and partnering in ways that don't thwart the academic mission.
Sure. Thank you for allowing that tangent into Amazon world. But to come back to the tenure and promotion process for faculty, obviously near and dear to all of you, can you talk a little bit about some of the more promising examples you've seen out there of institutions addressing the student success issue with an equity frame
Yes.
in tenure and promotion?
Yes. Certainly one of the best examples is Rutgers Newark. Nancy Cantor has worked with faculty and administrative leaders, Tim Eatman in particular, to come up with guidelines for tenure and promotion that recognize their role as an anchor institution in their community, demonstrating that the success of Rutgers Newark is inextricably linked to the success of the communities they serve. And so they have facilities that allow open access to community members to come in and to use their video equipment or to use their dance studios. They have maker spaces. And so there's no division. And the study you referred to earlier, we know shows that while people mistrust higher education in general, they trust their local institutions and they believe that their own institution, because many of the people responding to these polls have had the privilege of attending a higher educational institution, they have faith in those.
They do.
So we need to make sure that we are reaching those who are outside of the academy, who believe that we continue to exist in an ivory tower as a willful disconnect from the practical matters of everyday life. And to do that, we have to be in the communities themselves. As much as we welcome them onto our campuses, they're not going to come if they don't feel they deserve a place in the academy or on those campuses. And so by being a visible force in the lives of those who are the most marginalized and disenfranchised members of society, we make a start in breaking down those barriers. But are we rewarding faculty for doing that work, for engaging in the community, for helping residents pass legislation, for working on issues of racial and social justice? We're often not. So they provide a model of excellence. Worcester Polytechnic Institute, WPI, in Worcester, Massachusetts, focused on engineering, technical education, has also made a commitment to ensuring that faculty and staff are rewarded for that kind of community engagement.
You know, thinking about the challenges students bring to their studies and their lives, you know, there's been a lot of attention in the last couple of years on basic needs of students, you know, food insecurity, homelessness, you know, states, New York, California, actually funding food pantries, a lot there. You know, the psychological and social challenges students face. What do you see as the role for faculty, who are typically, I know, stretched quite thin already, to address some of those challenges, really basic, fundamental challenges that derail students?
We need to do a better job training faculty, but also training graduate students to deal with the kinds of challenges that students are facing. So we have to jettison this notion that college classrooms are filled with traditional age students who can devote their full attention to learning. And look at Sarah Goldick-Robb's research, the Wisconsin Hope Lab research, but also the work that she's doing now with Equity. So if 3/4 of community college students face issues of food insecurity, if 14% are homeless, Seaver Sheldon talks about the reduction of cognitive bandwidth that goes along with these issues that students are facing today. You cannot worry about your biology exam tomorrow if you have to worry about getting beaten to death because you're living in your car or on the street, or if you have no food for your children. And so these programs in California that are mandating food pantries or helping individuals get assistance with SNAP are critically important in addressing the equity issues on college campuses.
Great point. You know, I was on a panel last week with some rural community college leaders talking about their desperate situations where I feel like a lot of darkness in this interview. We'll try to turn it up a bit. But, you know, really, one of these leaders was talking about how their community colleges are viewed in the local communities as kind of like prisons, where they're job providers, you know, primarily, and there's, you know, the programming doesn't work because there aren't jobs, and you can't hire a faculty member to train, you know, 3 people. And these are real examples. You know, do you worry? Higher ed is being asked to do too much, to solve too many of society's problems. I mean, obviously, there are things that need to be improved. But when I was just hearing you talk about basic needs, the challenge seems pretty daunting for faculty members or college leaders.
It is, but I don't think it's too daunting. I think it's part of our mission and the obligation that we have. I think about the free tuition programs that have been passed in many states and ways that they can be improved. And they fail to take into account, in many instances, what you've talked about with respect to rural community colleges in particular. So if you are, it depends on whether you're looking at first or last dollar programs. If you are forcing students to use their Pell Grants, Perkins loans, other funding, and then you come in and you meet the rest of the costs for tuition, then students can't afford to get to class because they have no car. There's no public transportation in rural areas. They have no way to eat. But if you go in and you say, we're going to allow you to use this money for some of those needs, then that makes a world of difference. It opens access in a new way. So I think we need to help inform legislators and those who are attempting to do the right thing in creating access to excellence about the realities of our students' lives.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was just thinking of the City University of New York System's ASAP program, which provides subway MTA cards to students, and it's resource intensive, but it looks like financially it pays off in terms of retention gains. And then they applied it in Ohio, with gas cards and different tools, and again are seeing promising results. Things do work.
They do. University of South Florida has shelter for students in addition to food pantries.
Didn't know that.
And their retention rates for students at the lowest socioeconomic rungs and students of color have increased dramatically.
Wow, didn't know that. Taking notes. So the faculty diversity pipeline, let's transition to that. We did a pretty deep dive on that lately, and I was struck by the subtle pieces. Some of the impacts that one can have on thinking about processes in very subtle and ways. But I'm just wondering, what are you seeing in terms of promising developments out there? What do you want colleges to do more of?
Certainly understand the hidden biases that go into the selection process of candidates, but also to look at graduate training to work with professional societies on delivering a new sort of graduate education. So that the narrow focus on knowledge that nobody else has produced before places graduate students at risk, I think, in a world where we are pushing interdisciplinary, integrative learning. And as Jim Grossman points out with the American Historical Association, 1 out of 6 history PhDs will go into the academy. What are the other 5 going to do? How are we preparing them? So looking at alternative ways of using that education, both in the academy and outside of the academy, is more important than ever.
Absolutely. Over the years, AAC&U has been, I think, a crucial voice on questions about emerging models like competency-based education and the really fundamental changes that doing that right pose to higher education, specifically unbundling faculty roles and kind of control of curriculum, who's the subject matter expert and who's the coach. And just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, I did a panel with the president of Western Governors University and Mitch Daniels, who's the president of Purdue University, a very powerful former governor. And we were afraid, it was a room of journalists, that everyone would just want to ask Mitch Daniels questions because he's kind of a celebrity. And it turned out when the Western Governors president described how their faculty model works, it was so different. He got all the questions for the entire panel. And it's also threatening, I think, frankly. And oddly under the radar if you're interested in faculty governance. And I'm not saying that their model, to me, is flawed, but you do have very different roles for faculty members. And what are your thoughts about the potential for that sort of unbundling spreading as we see these mega universities, Southern New Hampshire, Western Governors, that are really becoming more dominant online nationally?
Well, those are examples of institutions that do a very good job, and they have a much higher level of student success than other institutions that people have been critical of in terms of their retention rates and the fact that the students who graduate have high debt burdens. So I think we do need to look at new models as we push toward a connection between curriculum to career, the curricular and the co-curricular and integrative learning. We get back to this notion of what we're rewarding faculty for doing. It's not publishing in arcane peer-reviewed journals, but instead looking at the ways that they are transforming student lives. And we know from the Gallup-Purdue study, for instance, what allows students to thrive in the classroom and in the workforce 10, 20, 30 years later are projects that last for a semester or more, interaction with faculty outside of the classroom, the opportunity to engage in study abroad, community-based learning, service learning opportunities. These are activities that, especially with faculty of color, if you are engaged in mentoring students, can turn into microaggressions because there's no reward for that. There's an expectation that you will serve the needs of all students of color or all LGBTQ students. Or so how are we changing, how are we recognizing that work in ways that doesn't cause people to leave the academy?
No, it's hard to generalize across the entire academy, but how advanced do you see that that adjustment to that need? I mean, are smattering of institutions are doing something progressive there, or no? the alarm hasn't?
Most institutions are recognizing the need. One of the other challenges for higher education today is a high turnover in terms of leadership. So with the average of the president and chancellor tenure being 6 years, there's a destabilization for institutions when faculty, staff, administrators are working toward a common goal, and now a new leader comes in, and so there's planning fatigue, there's initiative fatigue, and there's skepticism with respect to real change.
Yeah, I have to say, when I covered the presidency at the Chronicle in my early days, and I was a bit skeptical of, do we maybe put too much attention on the presidents? And over time, I've come to believe that you look at institutions that really have changed their profile, what they do. It's often a president who's been there 10 years. And so that it turns out leadership does matter, I think.
It does.
Where do you see the discussion about adjunctification heading, particularly when institutions are contemplating further public funding disinvestment and potential recession? Not an easy question here, but do you see more conversations about new ways of doing faculty contracts, new types of hires? I mean, what are you looking at?
Yeah, well, we're looking at institutions that are relinquishing a 10-year model and going to long-term contracts, 10-year contracts, or even shorter contracts. Some relying on adjuncts, but having different models. So you could be a long-term adjunct faculty member where you have basically the rights and privileges other than tenure of tenured faculty. So you can participate in faculty governance processes, you get sabbaticals, you can get research rewards. And so those models, I think, are the best in terms of addressing concerns about equity issues. But this is a reality for especially public institutions, and even for independent institutions that have generous sabbatical policies. So if a third of your faculty at an independent institution is on sabbatical every year, then you have to replace those faculty. Who do you replace them with? They're not people who are tenured faculty, but short-term professors. It's important to provide the professional training necessary and to provide rewards for those faculty members to engage with students in ways that we know are going to promote student success.
Sure, absolutely. Obviously, we've seen a lot of consolidation, mergers of institutions of late. Certainly seen an uptick in closures, nothing like what was predicted, but it's starting to pick up some speed. What sort of opportunities and challenges do you see in more consolidation, more sharing of offerings, administrative capacities, but faculty as well? Do you see, for liberal education, how much of a challenge and opportunity does that present?
Well, I'm from a system, when I was at Mount Holyoke, where 5 colleges cooperated closely together and very effectively.
Yes.
We shared faculty, we shared students, we shared campus police services, IT services, a bus system. That was a very effective model because of the proximity of the institutions and commitment to having a shared calendar and using shared resources. It's more challenging for rural institutions, but the use of technology provides opportunities to teach courses, to share faculty, and to share resources. Bishop's University in Canada has this model of working with other institutions across Canada on delivering integrative courses. They're held in different classrooms across the college campuses, but the others are brought in virtually. So technology provides real opportunities for saving and for retaining our commitment to liberal education.
Are you concerned though about in a scenario, and again, you come from a very successful, you've worked in a very successful model of consolidation and sharing, but of institutions losing some of their kind of core mission in terms of their commitment to liberal education as they work together across boundaries, or can that be preserved? I mean, I think it can.
I think it can be preserved as well. We were talking earlier about the consolidation in the Connecticut community college system. And that does place institutions at risk because they have eliminated the college presidents in many institutions and now have directors who are stepping in. Without that leadership, it's very difficult to focus on the needs of particular students in a region. And the cultural needs are must inform at least community college missions. And so I think there is a risk there. So students in an urban community college or an urban public institution have needs that are different from those in rural settings. And I think the challenges there need to be addressed in more systematic ways.
Absolutely. So I'm going to open up to questions in a minute here. So if you've got one, start getting ready. And so we have a microphone that's going to circulate. But one more from me, because I can do that as the moderator. We had a series of stories in Hiram College in Ohio that really seemed to capture people's attention. Pretty desperate financial situation. I would say it certainly appeared to me to be existential. The president made that case. The faculty didn't quite buy that case, but knew that there were serious problems. And so the classic liberal arts curriculum heavily injected to deal with this challenge with more professional vocational studies, a real change in the personality and flavor of the college. And many faculty members were unhappy with this. But when we spoke with the president and saw the finances, she basically told us, I came in, didn't know how bad it was, realized that I could get through maybe 5 to 7 years, retire, and then watch it implode later. And I feel like many of my colleagues are going through that same thought process. As institutions do try to adjust to shifting demographics and finances, what are the most important pieces they should consider as they think about adding more professional studies to a liberal education?
There's nothing wrong with adding more professional studies if the professional education is infused with the liberal education. I mentioned earlier, I'm a medical ethicist, and so I know from my own experience that the kinds of issues that physicians, healthcare professionals are dealing with today around end-of-life issues and beginning-of-life issues require them to engage in ethical decision-making. Used to be, when I was on ethics committees, that it was all about the right to die a natural death with dignity. After the Karen Ann Quinlan case, you want to refuse life-sustaining treatment. Let's talk about that. Now, patients and their families are increasingly asking for everything to be done to keep them alive at all costs. So we get to issues of allocation of scarce medical resources. How do we balance diversity and pluralism against the rights of justice and fairness to all? How do we deal with the notion that, or the reality that in our society, death is viewed as a failure and so distinctly un-American? These issues are going to be addressed by patients and their healthcare teams, not through the technical training that physicians receive, but through a liberal education. And everybody who's involved in technology today is going to be dealing with ethical issues because technological advancements have preceded thoughtful reflection about the ethical, legal, and social implications of the use of that technology.
Absolutely. I was thinking that this morning who did the Face app? Anyone do the Face app?
Oh, yes, yeah.
There was a story in the Post about it. It was a Russian technology and some concerns among Democratic operatives that it could be used to harvest information. So you might want to read that article. Things happen fast, and then you look back and wow. So questions, don't be shy. I've got a couple more. I see one over here, and actually one right here too. Let's start here, and then we'll get you next. Sorry.
I'd like to go back to your comment about adjunctification. I love that term. And as appointments and promotion specialists in the room, we're kind of unofficial guidance to the new faculty coming in. I mean, they come to us like, what do I need to do? What do you need from me? But there's an opportunity there for us to kind of guide them, even though it's on the administrative front, to help them maneuver their career. So with tenure becoming less and less of a goal for many faculty, because it's just going away in so many areas, what advice would you give to an early academic career individual, and how to manage that roadmap for them?
Well, department heads often tell pre-tenured faculty to focus on research and publication, to get grants to publish in peer-reviewed journals. If that's a reality at an institution, then you should do that until you get tenure, and then you can broaden your portfolio. But in the meantime, I would suggest connecting those individuals to networks, professional development networks, so teaching and learning, where they can partner with people outside of their discipline and have mentors that are so important, especially if we are talking about mentoring faculty of color or faculty whose identities are going to require them to do work that goes beyond what's recognized in the tenure and promotion process. So I used to, when I started teaching, my colleagues would ask me to serve on all sorts of committees, and I loved doing that work, and so I would say yes to everything. I did what I was passionate about, but there was one of my colleagues, Cheryl Foster, who tapped me on the shoulder, and she said, look, before you say yes to anything else, I want you to call me and say, I've been asked to serve on this, and she made me do this with 3 people and ask their advice on whether this was worth my investment in time and talent, and that was very helpful. I often didn't listen to their advice, but it was very helpful because it gave me their perspective on whether I was really going to disappoint people and trying to get over that feeling, or whether this was bad for me professionally, and then how to balance the realities of these complex lives. And let me just add, this was before email. And so now it's even much more difficult because you're on call 24/7. And people can turn it off and say, I don't answer emails at night, but then in the morning you've got dozens of emails.
Hi, I'm from the University of Washington, and we are next door neighbors with Amazon and Google and Microsoft. And my question is, one of the reasons they may be driving their own research and curriculum efforts is because they can afford to poach some of the leading edge thinkers from academia. What are your thoughts on faculty salaries as a root cause for that problem? And my second question is, I would like to hear your thoughts on the national dialogue around a teaching track.
Yeah. Faculty salaries certainly can be improved. Some of the poaching I see is not a result of faculty salary concerns. So, and for instance, Candace is on leave from Stanford. And so it's the idea that I can be involved in this innovative approach, or I can be involved in this initiative that I find exciting and still go back to the academy. So that's where tenure is helpful. Poaching of faculty of color is a different matter, and so that's a real risk where outside industries can come in, and we need to pay attention to retention, not just recruitment, but retention issues. I would love there to be a teaching track for faculty, for future faculty. The Council of Graduate Schools used to have preparing future faculty programs that prepared future faculty for teaching in all types of institutions. If PhD programs are preparing future professionals for teaching at all, it's to teach in the sort of institution where they're being trained. So one of my sons just finished his PhD in African American Studies in 2017. He didn't have to do any teaching because he had fellowships. And so it seems like the students who are seen as top tier researchers don't have any experience teaching, but they're sent off into the classroom anyway. Who does that put at risk? Both the faculty member and the students. So we need to really focus on those issues. I love that idea of returning to the notion of a teaching track.
I think I saw one up here. Yep.
Hi, so this question is for both of you, and it is also, I will preface it by saying, potentially controversial. But going back to a point that was made earlier in the conversation about liberal education versus liberalism politically, has there been any conversation that you're aware of to attempt to rebrand a liberal education with a different moniker in order to separate those two things? in an age where lies are alternative facts, is that something that we should be looking at doing in order to try to separate those two things so that higher education is not seen as something that is politically liberal, although some of us are? What are your thoughts?
This is something we talk about every single day, and it's not just at AAC&U, it's at the Council of Independent Colleges, CIC, ACE. Anybody who's committed to fostering liberal education looks at the reality of the language we use and how that creates barriers. So our last annual meeting was at the opening plenary was on code switching, how we need to talk in new ways. And Brandon Bastide, who was at Gallup and now is at Kaplan, is a supporter of changing the language. Talk about the skills that we're trying to promote, but don't talk about it in terms of a liberal education. We have been, or at least my board has been, resistant to that, and it's along the lines of appropriating terms and doubling down and saying, this is who we are. And our job is to educate people about the origin of this word, which is to liberate the mind from past dispositions. So the Stoics' notion that it is essential for a democracy to have people who can discern the truth through critical thinking. It is threatening, maybe more threatening to people who have a much more conservative viewpoint, to imagine the possibility that their children will abandon some of the beliefs that they hold as fundamental to the values that they've taught their children. And so, but if we look at it in terms of the traditional notion of a liberal education was that neither liberalism nor conservatism in the academy would constitute a liberal education, because that's orthodoxy. What we need is heterodoxy. Then it becomes less threatening. That's why we need to get out and talk to people about the real value. And so I know when I graduated from Brown, I invited my father. I hadn't lived with him for many years, but when I graduated and invited him to see me get my PhD, he said, let me tell you two things. First of all, I'm not going to spend 35 cents a gallon to go up that hill in Providence. Because this is a long time ago. Second of all, don't you think this makes you better than us? Because it doesn't, and you're not. So here's where a simple congratulations would have been fine. But it revealed to me his deep-seated fear that I would somehow remove myself from the family because of the education that I received. And so I think about how I was able to sit down at the table and have a kitchen conversation with him about what my education meant to me and to the family. How do we have those table conversations with people across the country and indeed around the world who are concerned that the type of education we're offering will be a disruption to their social values, to their religious values, to their way of life? That's what we need to do.
I'm tempted to fully duck because I'm merely a reporter, not an expert. But because we're talking about public perception, I will hazard a brief answer. I think, it's unfortunate that so much of what we have to discuss in contemporary society has a partisan flavor to it. Frustrates me personally, but I do think when you look at the numbers of faculty members and students in American higher education and how they identify, they're extremely liberal compared to the general population. It's just a basic fact. And I think if the academy acknowledged that fact a bit and then focused more in responding to challenges that we ensure a free inquiry among our students, that maybe I would suggest not denying that initial concern from some folks, because I think the numbers do say that there is a skew, and that's just undeniable. I think we may have time for one last question. Very good questions, by the way. Maybe not? Nope. I thought I saw one.
Oh, whenever Daniel.
Try to keep this one kind of brief because we're running out of time here.
I will. So I think that we definitely have administrators in this room. We definitely have faculty in this room. But I know for sure that we have a large number of staff in this room. And most of what you talked about on stage, like, we're here for it. We support this mission. But in a lot of areas, and talking to a lot of my colleagues across a lot of institutions, there's a really profound tension between staff and faculty. And if we want to be part of supporting these larger missions that advance the goals of higher education, how can we get not necessarily a seat at the table, because I definitely recognize that that is a huge ask, but how can we support this and maybe do it from a place where we feel like our opinion is valuable? Is that too tough a question?
No, it's a
Sorry.
great question, and we hear this over and over again, especially as we are focusing on the whole student, on student well-being. Staff need to be, well, they are central to the conversation. So when we want to train faculty to deal with the realities of student lives in order to promote the learning that takes place in the classroom, we can't do that in isolation. This gets back to the reward structures, the structural impediments to integrative teaching and learning. At Mount Holyoke, our first year seminar was offered, and we had a team that was made up of a faculty member, a staff member, and a student who would serve as that student's mentor. And so that forces collaboration that is essential to the kind of work that needs to take place in the academy today. So those structures, being mindful of the ways in which you can create structures that will foster communication and collaboration, I think is one way to go. That's a great question.
Well, we are out of time. Please join me in thanking Lynn for her excellent presentation.